Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Can you imagine the terror of Louis XVI in front of the guillotine? Discover the shocking truth about its execution and the brutal end of your reign. Subscribe and activate the bell so as not to miss anything. Imagine the opulence of the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. His reign, a symbol of absolute power and French greatness, projected an elongated shadow on the monarchy. You know his image. An imposing monarch surrounded by luxury and sumptuousness, right? That legacy of splendor and absolutism was what Louis XVI inherited, a king who, unlike his ancestor, lacked the political strength and cunning to maintain the balance of power. The Sun King left behind a powerful France, but also deeply unequaled a feudal system in decline, a privileged nobility and a tax oppressed by taxes. This legacy, a mixture of brightness and misery, would be the breeding ground for the revolution that was coming. A system that Louis XVI, with its indecision and lack of vision, did not know how to reform. Louis XIV's inheritance weighed like a slab on his great-grandson. A legacy of power that, in the hands of Louis XVI, became an unbearable burden. The image of the Sun King, a symbol of the absolute monarchy, vanished before the growing social agitation and the clamor for change. That image of greatness would become a spectrum that persecuted the last king of France. But what do you know about his grandson's reign, Louis XVI? Unlike his extravagant predecessor, Louis XVI inherited a France mired in a deep economic crisis. His rise to the throne was like climbing a ship about to shipwreck. The nobility, accustomed to their privileges, refused to contribute to the royal coffers, while the people suffered misery and hunger. He tried reforms, of course, but his efforts were shy and not very effective. Clinging to tradition and with a rather undecided personality, Louis XVI was unable to deal with growing social pressure. The illustrated ideas, with their claims for freedom and equality, resonated strongly in the population while he stayed in his privileged bubble. The public deficit grew without control, aggravated by excessive court expenses. Attempts to solve the economic crisis, such as tax increase, only served to exacerbate popular discontent. The famine and the food crisis became a perfect breeding ground for the coming revolution. People were fed up. His grandfather, Louis XV, had spent full hands, leaving the empty real coffers. The feudal system, with its privileges for the nobility and the clergy, was completely outdated. Imagine. They tax-exempt, while the people suffered scarcity and hunger. People saw how the nobles lived in luxury, while they struggled to survive day by day. This economic imbalance was a watchmaking pump about to explode. The harvest of 1788 was bad, aggravating the food crisis. The price of bread shot and popular disturbances became increasingly frequent. Remember that the majority of the population depended on bread as a basic food. The lack of this translated into hunger, diseases, and despair. For them, it was a struggle for survival, a struggle that the king, from his palace, seemed to ignore. The feudal system, with its rigid structures and its extreme inequality, was the root of the problem. Taxes fell disproportionately over the peasants and the working class, which could barely remain afloat. Meanwhile, the nobility and the clergy, which possessed most of the earth, did not contribute enough to the real coffers. That insurmountable gap between rich and poor became a culture broth for the revolution. While the nobility and clergy lived in palacios, surrounded by luxury and opulence, you could imagine reality for most French. We talk about peasants working the land until exhaustion, with hardly any enough to survive. Their lives were a constant fight against hunger and disease, an endless cycle of poverty that was inherited from generation to generation. Think of the contrast. While some celebrated banquets, others fought for a piece of bread. In cities, the situation was not much better. Workers and artisans worked strenuous days in unhealthy workshops, for miserable salaries. The streets were crowded, full of misery and disease. The lack of hygiene, food shortages, and the precariousness of the houses created a perfect breeding ground for the propagation of epidemics. It was a hard life, a daily struggle for survival. The contrast between the overflowing wealth of the court and the extreme poverty of the people was abysmal, a gap that became deeper and deeper. While royalty enjoyed false parties and extravagant dances, most French could barely afford. This social inequality, this deep injustice, was the spark that ignited the fuse of the French Revolution. Can you imagine the frustration and rage they should have felt? /prosody. /speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Imagine the 18th century France. While you suffered the hardness of peasant life, a new type of thought began to bloom. We talk about the Enlightenment, an intellectual current that questioned the established order, the authority of the church and monarchical absolutism. Writers like Voltaire and Rousseau spread revolutionary ideas through their works, sowing the seed of change in the minds of many. These ideas, which promoted reason, individual freedom, and equality before the law, resonated strongly in an oppressed and hungry people. You could begin to understand how social inequality and oppression generated a perfect cultivation broth so that these ideas light like gunpowder. People began to question the reason for the opulence of the nobility while they suffered misery. The concept of popular sovereignty, the idea that power resides in the people and not in an absolute king, became a powerful engine of change. For you, who lived in poverty, the promise of a more just and equitable society, where everyone was the same before the law, had to sound like a song of hope in the midst of despair. The illustration offered you a new horizon, a different future than you had always known. But those ideas, so bright in theory, brutally collided with the reality of a France mired in inequality. You, witness to the opulence of the court of Versailles while you were hungry, you began to feel rage grow. The monarchy, accustomed to luxury and waste, ignored the suffering of its people. Taxes fell like a slab on the shoulders of the peasants and the working class, while the nobility and clergy enjoyed unimaginable privileges. The situation became unsustainable. The popular discontent, fed by illustrated ideas, began to organize. You, perhaps without realizing it, you were part of that change. The taking of the Bastille, the symbol of real power, was not an isolated act, but the result of years of injustice and oppression. It was the outbreak of a revolution that would change forever the course of history. Suddenly, everything changed. The streets of Paris became a battlefield. Perhaps you participated in the manifestations, in the barricades, or you were simply witnessing violence and chaos. The French Revolution had begun, and with it, the fall of the absolute monarchy. The king, Louis XVI, was no longer untouchable. His reign, until then symbol of power and authority, staggered before the unstoppable force of the people. So, there you were, seeing how popular discontent, fed by famine and inequality, pushed the bourgeoisie to make a radical decision. Form the National Constituent Assembly. An act of direct challenge to the king, Louis XVI, who refused to accept the necessary reforms. Imagine the tension in the air, uncertainty about the future, fear mixed with the hope of a real change. The oath of the ball game marked a turning point. In an open space, the representatives of the Third State, challenging the real authority, promised not to separate until France had a constitution. An act of courage that resonated throughout the country, and that you, surely, continued with the contained breathing. The assembly, once formed, began the arduous task of writing a new constitution. Heated debates, endless discussions, and the constant threat of real intervention. You, silent witness of all this, you could feel the pressure, the weight of the story on their shoulders. They were crucial times, where each word could change the course of the nation. But the National Constituent Assembly was only the beginning. You, witness to the growing tension. You would have seen how the news of the concentration of real troops around Paris ignited the fuse. The people, fed up with the oppression and inefficiency of the king, prepared for action. The Bastille, prison symbol of real power, became the objective. A medieval strength, with its imposing walls and its historical meaning, represented everything that the people wanted to tear down. Remember that morning of July 14, 1789. You would have heard the roar of the crowd, a sea of angry faces, determined to conquer the Bastille. The fight was fierce, an unequal confrontation between civilians armed with what they could find and the real troops that defended the strength. The sound of the shots, the rumble of the stones against the stones, the shout of the injured, a scene of chaos and courage. The fall of the Bastille was not only a military victory, but a symbol. For you, a spectator of those events, the taking of the prison meant the end of an oppressive regime. The destruction of the Bastille became a collective cry of freedom, a turning point in the French Revolution, a clear message to the king and his government. The people had aroused and nothing would be the same. Prosody, speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. The tension was palpable. You, in the midst of chaos, would have heard rumors about a statement that promised to change France forever. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a document that, in theory, guaranteed freedom, equality, and fraternity, concepts that until then had been only a dream for many. But would it be enough to calm the fury that boil in the streets? The statement proclaimed popular sovereignty, the right to freedom of expression, the presumption of innocence, words that resonated strongly, but whose effective application was yet to be seen. You, a first-hand witness, would have seen hope in the eyes of some, the distrust of others. Was the beginning of a new era really, or just a truce before an even greater storm? For you, the statement represented a turning point. A document that, although idealistic, reflected the deep aspiration to social justice that was beating in the heart of the revolution. However, reality was complex, full of contradictions and ambivalences. The gap between theory and practice would be enormous, and the path to equality and freedom much longer and rugged than you imagined. After the statement, France entered a delicate experiment. The constitutional monarchy. It was a bold attempt to balance real power with the new ideas of freedom and equality. Imagine Louis XVI still king, but now with his powers limited by a national assembly chosen by the people. A king with the crown, but without the absolute control that his ancestors had had. Would this new formula work? Reality, however, was much more complex. The king, accustomed to governing without restrictions, was reluctant to give up his authority. Attempts to escape, conspiracies in the shadow, and the growing distrust of the people were undermining the fragile structure of this new monarchy. You, at that time, would have perceived a growing tension, a feeling that peace was an ephemeral illusion. The National Assembly, meanwhile, was not exempt from problems, divided into factions, with heated debates and often contradictory decisions. He was unable to exercise effective control over the king or to calm the population's spirits. For you, the political landscape would have been a maze of changing intrigues and alliances, where uncertainty reigned supreme. The constitutional monarchy, in essence, was a castle of cards about to collapse. The constitutional monarchy was a fragile balance, and you know that distrust of Louis XVI and Maria Antonietta was still latent. For many, the royal family represented the old regime, an obstacle to the new France. So on a dark night, wrapped in the secret, the king and the queen, along with their children, decided to flee. Its destiny. Varennes, a town in the northeast of the country, from where they could seek refuge and reorganize their forces. I imagine the tension in the carriage, the silence broken only by the rattle of the wheels and the beats of their hearts. The idea was to cross the border with Austria, seeking the support of other monarchies to recover their power. But the flight, planned with stealth, was far from being perfect. In carelessness, a bad decision, a simple delay, could condemn his plans. And so it was. In Varennes, the royal family was recognized. The news of his escape spread like gunpowder. The hope of the monarchists vanished, while the revolution was strengthened. The capture of Louis XVI and his family was a devastating blow for the monarchy, an irrefutable proof of his lack of confidence in the French people and an unequivocal sign of his opposition to the new order. After Varennes, confidence in the monarchy collapsed. The National Assembly was divided between two features: La Girondanda, more moderate, and the Mountain, radical and determined to end the old regime. You saw how the Girondinos, defenders of a constitutional republic, faced the Mountaineers, led by figures such as Robespierre and Marat, who advocated a more radical republic and without concessions to the monarchy. The Mountain, with its incendiary rhetoric and its powerful influence on the Parisian masses, gained ground. His calls for republican virtue and the elimination of the enemies of the revolution resonated strongly in a town tired of oppression and hunger. You presented how popular agitation, fed by Mountain propaganda, increased pressure on the assembly and the same monarchy. The Gironde, although it had the support of some sectors of the bourgeoisie, was overcome by the growing strength of the Mountain. His moderation, which for some was prudence, for others was weakness, made them lose ground in the agitated political scene. You were witnessing how the growing radicalization of the French Revolution left the Gironde more and more isolated and vulnerable to the relentless advance of its opponents. Prosody. Speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. After Varennes, the situation became critical. The Austrian war declaration in Prussia, in support of the monarchy, did nothing more than even more radicalize the assembly. You will wonder, why did they dare to declare war on France? Well, European powers saw with terror the expansion of revolutionary ideas, threatening the established order and their own privileges. The threat to the French monarchy was a threat to its own existence. Imagine the pressure on Louis XVI, accused of betrayal for his escape and now facing a war against the great European powers. His position became unsustainable. The French army, demoralized and divided, offered no guarantees of victoria. The war became a determining factor in the king's fall, since his actions, or rather, the lack of them during the conflict, were interpreted as a clear sample of their inability to lead. The war became a struggle for the survival of the revolution itself. The outer threat strengthened the most radical sectors, who saw in the war an opportunity to purge the counter-revolutionaries and consolidate their power. For you, war was not only a military conflict, but an ideological struggle that defined the fate of France and, in a way, that of Europe. After Varennes, the guillotine hovered like a shadow. You imagine the tension. The judgment of Louis XVI became a macabre show, a political circus where the fate of the king was debated between loyalty to the monarchy and the revolutionary fervor. The process was a farce, a pantomime for history. The most radical revolutionaries wanted their head, while others advocated an exile or a less drastic sentence. But public opinion, inflamed by propaganda and fear, asked for blood. The accusation was overwhelming: betrayal of the nation. He was accused of conspiring against the revolution, of financing his enemies and hindering the progress of the nation. You will ask yourself if it was fair. The evidence was weak, based on rumors and suspicions, but the rare era of the time did not allow objectivity. The testimonies of the witnesses were manipulated, or directly invented to feed the popular hatred against the monarch. The trial became a theater of cruelty. The defense lawyer, although he tried to defend the king with solid arguments, faced a hostile hearing and a partial court. His voice was lost in the clamor of the crowd that requested revenge. The sentence was practically written before the trial began. The death sentence of Louis XVI, issued by a tight majority, sealed its destiny. It was a decision that would mark forever the course of the French Revolution, a decision that divided the nation even more. Remember that in that trial, Robespierre's figure stood imposing. His speech, cold and calculating, painted Louis XVI as a ruthless tyrant, an enemy of the people who was worth the maximum. He, the incorruptible, appeared as the defender of the revolution, the only one capable of guiding France towards a fair future, even if that meant the death of the king. You observed how his penetrating gaze seemed to pierce the accused himself, transmitting a coldness that froze the bones. And then there was Amareth with his pale and emaciated face, his eyes full of a sickly fury. His pen, as sharp as his language, had already written pages and pages accusing the king of betrayal and crimes against the nation. Now, in the trial room, his presence was a Thorbellino of negative energy, an echo of his incendiary writings that resonated in every corner of the place. His hatred of the monarchy was palpable, a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. You, as a silent witness of this drama, you perceived the synergy between both revolutionaries. Robespierre, with his cold logic and his relentless eloquence, and Mareth, with his passionate rhetoric and his visceral hatred of the monarchy, formed a slow pair. Together, they wove a network of accusations that strangled any possibility of clemency for the king. Its relentless insistence on the guilt of Louis XVI sealed the fate of the monarch, a destination that would be consummated in the guillotine. Remember how Robespierre, with his icy voice, accused you of betrayal. He painted you as a conspirator, a man who had secretly agreed with enemies of France, endangering the revolution itself. He pointed to you as the head of the famine that whipped the country, a crime that, according to him, only a corrupt and unfair monarch to the people could commit. You were accused of wanting to restore the old regime, to sabotage revolutionary efforts from within the palace itself. /prosody /speak. Speak. The prosody rate equals 90%. The conspiracy, according to the accusers, was a complex network that involved noble, clergy, and foreigners, all united by a common goal: to end the revolution and restore the absolute power of the monarchy. You, like king, were the head of this snake. The key piece that allowed these traitors to operate in the shadow tests were presented, or at least what they called evidence, to support these statements. Intercepts, rumors, doubtful testimonies, everything was used to build a case against you. You were accused of secretly funding the counter-revolutionary armies, of having maintained a clandestine correspondence with foreign powers to request military aid and crush the revolution. You even accused you of having ordered the murder of revolutionary leaders, although there were no conclusive evidence. The important thing was the image that wanted to be screened, that of a traitorous king, an enemy of the people who deserved the most severe punishment. But you, Louis XVI, you didn't stay with crossed arms. Your lawyer, an ultranza defender of the monarchy, deployed a strategy to save you. He spoke of your good faith, about your desire to reform France from within, about the mistakes made by your directors, trying to divert the attention of your alleged crimes against Lisa Patria. He struggled to paint an image of a repentant king, a man who wanted the well-being of his people, although his efforts seemed in vain before the fierce accusation of Robespierre. They presented evidence, letters, testimonies, trying to dismantle the conspiracy woven by your enemies. Each word, each document, was a battle against time and the relentless machinery of the revolution. You remember the fleeting hope that gave you that defense, the moment you believed that perhaps, only perhaps, you could escape the destiny that awaited you. But the reality was relentless, and the truth, a molded tool at the convenience of the revolutionaries. The defense was a last desperate attempt to hold on to life, a shout drowned in the midst of the revolutionary storm. Despite the effort of your lawyers, the tide of the revolution was too powerful. His arguments, although solid, were diluted before the power of propaganda and the thirst for blood of the crowd, which had already condemned you long before the trial began. Your destiny was already sealed. But the defense, no matter how eloquent it was, could not stop the tide of the revolution. The National Convention, that hotbed of opinions and passions, prepared for vote. You, observing from your cell, imagined the tension in the living room, the atmosphere full of expectation. Each deputy, a weight in the balance of your destiny, a vote that would decide whether you would continue breathing or not. The moment came. The sepulchral silence that preceded the vote count was, surely, heavier than any condemnation. You imagine the slow and deliberate opening of the polls, each ballot a hammer blow on your heart, every sound one more step towards the inevitable, guilty or innocent. The question resonated in the cold room, as cold as the one that awaited you. The verdict fell like a guillotine. Most pronounced, guilty. Your life, your reign, your story, reduced to a simple vote. The death sentence hovered over you, relentless, definitive. The clamor of the crowd, despite the distance, would surely reach your cell. Esa multitud que, alguna vez, te acclamó como rey, ahora pedia tu sangre. Silence fell on the National Convention after the announcement, a dense silence, loaded with the accumulated tension for weeks of heated debates. You, from your privileged position, observed the inexpressive face of Louis XVI, a man who had reigned with absolute power and now faced his own mortality. The sentence was there, cold and relentless. Death by guillotine, the end of a monarchy, the end of a reign. The news spread like gunpowder in Paris. That in the streets, people argued, some celebrated, others were in shock. For many it was justice, for others a tragedy. But for Louis XVI it was the end of his reign, the end of his life, the end of his story. An end that quoted on him, inevitable and imminent. The days that followed were in agony. You, silent witness of his last transit, imagined his thoughts, his regrets, his fears. The king, accustomed to pomp and luxury, faced a humiliating and public death. His destiny was sealed. Guillotine was waiting for him. The end of a reign, the end of an era. Prosody, speak. Speak, to prosody rate equals 90%. The sepulchral silence of the convention still resonated in your ears. Now, the prison became your universe. The stone, cold and humid walls seemed to whisper the imminence of your end. Louis XVI, dethroned king, was confined to a small cell, stripped of his greatness, his reduced reign awaiting guillotine. The food, scarce and without grace, barely passed through his throat. Time stretched, an incessant torment that marked the countdown to its execution. They allowed you some visits, brief moments of comfort offered by their family. But they were encounters loaded with a deep sadness, a silent and painful farewell, anticipating the imminent goodbye. The conversations, tenuous and choppy, revolved around faith, to the hope of a life after death, a comfort before the harsh reality that hovered over them. Each word, each look, became an invaluable treasure in those dark days. The night before the execution, the calm before the storm, you saw it, preparing for the inevitable. There was no anger or despair, just a deep resignation. That he dressed simply. A sober clothing that contrasted with the opulence of his past, he prayed, looking for comfort in his faith, while the cold night breeze sneaked through the window slits, an omen of the cold blade that awaited at dawn. The cold fell to your bones. They stripped you of your real clothes, replacing them with a simple white shirt, symbol of public humiliation that was coming. They tied your hands behind your back with a rough rope, feeling the cold pressure of the rope against your skin. The silence was dense, broken just because of the squeak of the wood of the car that awaited you. They climbed you into the car, a coarse and rash vehicle, destined to take you to the gallows. The tour was short, but he felt eternal. The crowd, a sea of hostile and enraged faces, surrounded you. Its screams and murmurs came to you like a deafening echo. The weight of death became more and more tangible. In the square, the guillotine was waiting for you impassively, a cold and efficient machine, ready to carry out its macabre task. The executioner, a silent and gloomy man, approached you, his precise and emotion movements preparing the final scene of your life. The air was loaded with a palpable tension, a sepulchral silence prior to the final blow. They led you through the streets of Paris, between an immense and silent crowd. The silence was more scary than any shout. Each step was another weight in your soul, every look a relentless judgment. The white shirt, wet for cold and sweat, stuck to your skin. You felt the pressure of the strings on your wrists, a constant reminder of your unavoidable destination. The car, a carriage macabre, was waiting for you at the end of this ordeal. You rose to the car, the tracketing of the wheels on the cobblestone resonated in your ears like a funeral beat. The icy air whipped your face. Around you, the looks were a mixture of hate, curiosity, and, perhaps, a hint of compassion. But your gaze was fixed on the horizon, looking for an escape, an answer, something that could change the inevitable course of your terrible trip. The tour was short, but he felt eternal. Each bump, every noise, every sigh of the crowd seemed to amplify in your mind, becoming a deafening echo of your own mortality. Destiny was approaching, inexorable, relentless. Guillotine. A dark silhouette in the distance, materialized slowly, waiting for its victim. The end was in sight. The square was crowded. A sepulchral silence wrapped you. A silent silence that you could almost touch it. You felt the weight of thousands of eyes on you, although many faces were hidden after the crowd. The gallows, a macabre wooden structure, stood imposing, projecting its shadow on you. It was the end. The cold steel of the guillotine looked at you, cold and indifferent, waiting. They climbed you to the platform. The sound of your feet over wood echoed with a disturbing clarity. The look of the executioners was impassive, professional. There was no mercy on his eyes, only the cold efficiency of his task. You felt the wind on your face, the last gust of outdoors before the dark. A last sigh before the end. The deaf noise of the blade cutting the air was almost imperceptible. An eternal moment. A silence that lasted during an eternity. Then, absolute silence. The crowd remained motionless, as petrified by horror, for the weight of the historical moment he had just witnessed. The king had fallen, the end of an era. So you saw it. The axe fell. A groan, almost imperceptible at the beginning, rose from the crowd. A whisper that grew to become a deafening roar. Some shouted, others cried. A torrent of contradictory emotions. You, lost in the middle of the crowd, you felt the weight of history, the burden of the revolution, in the intensity of those moments. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. The joy was palpable. An explosion of joy contained for years. The shouts of "Long live the Republic," mixed with the regrets of those who saw in the execution not a victory, but an act of barbarism. The square was a sea of faces, a mixture of frantic and silent horror celebration, a testimony of the fragility of life and the complexity of the revolution. Suddenly, a heartbreaking cry startled you. A woman, with a convulsive face for pain, shouted disconsolate, cursing the revolution and her leaders. His despair brutally contrasted with the victory songs that resonated around him. At that moment, the thin line between celebration and terror faded, leaving only the harsh reality of violence and loss. The silence that followed the coup was almost scarier than the scream. A heavy silence, loaded with the disbelief of thousands of witnesses. For many, the execution of Louis XVI was not only the end of a king, but the end of an order. You could feel the change in the air, a palpable expectation of what would come later, a new era of peace, or an even larger bloodbath. In later days, Paris became a hotbed of rumors and speculations. The monarchy had fallen, yes, but what arose instead? Uncertainty was the queen now, more powerful than any king or queen. For you, it was impossible not to perceive fear mixed with euphoria in the streets, an explosive cocktail that foreshadowed more drastic changes. Beyond Paris, the news of the execution spread like gunpowder in the provinces. The reaction was diverse. Some celebrated the king's fall, while others clung desperately to the old power structures. For you, it was evident that France had fractured, divided between those who celebrated the revolution and those who feared it. The country was at a turning point, a cliff. Beyond the French borders, the news of the end of Louis XVI resonated as a thunder in European monarchies. The impact was immediate. The execution of a king, something unheard of in centuries, sowed terror and uncertainty. The European nobles trembled, seeing in the guillotine a reflection of their own destiny. Security measures were intensified in the royal palaces, and the monarchs began to implement reforms to avoid revolutionary contagion. The execution of Louis XVI became a symbol of the fight against absolutism. For many, it was a victory of reason and the people over tyranny in Great Britain. The radicals emboldened, while the aristocracy feared the spread of revolutionary ideas en otros países. El evento aceleró el desarrollo de movimientos reformistas que buscaban limitar el poder de la monarquía y mejorar las condiciones de vida de la población. But the reaction was not unanimous. Many saw in the death of the king an act of barbarism and a dangerous precedent. Austria and Prussia, allies of the French monarchy, considered the execution of a serious provocation, increasing international tension and preparing the scenario for the revolutionary wars that were to come. The execution of Louis XVI not only marked the end of a king, but also the beginning of a new era in Europe, full of deep conflicts and transformations. The execution of Louis XVI left Maria Antonietta alone, completely homeless. Imagine. From queen to prisoner, surrounded by the revolutionary fury that her husband could not control, his elegant life in Versailles, full of luxuries and privileges, had become a cold, hunger nightmare and the constant threat of death. The woman who once was the center of attention, now was just a shadow, waiting for her own destiny. Remember that they accused her of betrayal and waste. He judged it hard, without mercy. His letters, his conversations, everything was used against him, as evidence to condemn it to the guillotine. However, Maria Antonietta maintained an incredible strength, a dignity that accompanied her to the end. Despite the horror that surrounded her, he had to face his own mortality. The idea of dying as a criminal, something unimaginable to her in her past. His judgment was a farce, a show for the French people thirsty for revenge. But she, with her real bearing, refused to break in front of the enraged crowd, in front of his accusers. He kept his head high, showing a courage that even surprised his enemies. Think about the courage that is needed to face death with such dignity, knowing that history would judge it with different eyes. After the execution of Louis XVI, uncertainty hidden over Maria Antonietta and her children. Imagine the anguish of the queen, now prisoner, seeing her little ones, the Dauphin Louis XVII and her sisters, Maria Theresa, Maria Luisa and Sophia, in the midst of that revolutionary storm. What future would hold the heirs of the French monarchy? The royal family, once a symbol of power and opulence, was at the mercy of popular fury, its uncertain and pendular destiny. Prosody, speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. The small 17 Louis, just a child, was subjected to a cruel captivity, separated from his mother. His health quickly deteriorated in the midst of misery and abandonment. Meanwhile, real princesses, also deprived of their liberty, lived in precarious conditions, waiting for an equally uncertain destination. The revolution, relentless, showed no mercy even for the youngest. The fate of each member of the royal family was different. Maria Antonietta, after an unfair judgment, was also executed, sealing the tragic end of the French monarchy. His daughters, meanwhile, were taken abroad, far from the revolutionary whirlwind. The fate of little Louis XVII was even more cruel. He died young, victim of disease and negligence in prison, without ever recovering his freedom or his title. Think about the legacy of Louis XVI. Was it a despotic king, clinging to an expired system, or a victim of circumstances, a man unable to control the revolutionary maelstrom who dragged him to the guillotine? His reign, marked by economic inefficiency and the growing social inequality, sowed the seed of the revolution. But was he really the sole responsible for the storm that unleashed? Some historians paint him as a weak, undecided king, unable to make the necessary decisions to avoid the collapse of the old regime. Others, on the other hand, see it as a man trapped in a corrupt system, victim of the ambition of the nobility and the growing popular agitation. The truth, as usually happens, is probably at some intermediate point. Its execution, a brutal act that shocked Europe, became a symbol of the revolution, a demonstration of the power of the people against the monarchy. But it also makes you ask you, to what extent did your own inaction contribute to your tragic end? Could he have avoided the revolution if he had acted more firmly, or with greater sensitivity towards the needs of the people? Think about what happened after the execution of Louis XVI. That the revolution, far from finishing, was radicalized. The monarchy had fallen, but the fight for power was far from resolving. The guillotine, a symbol of terror, became the protagonist of a bloody stage that set the history of France. You could imagine the fear that was breathed in the streets of Paris. The Reign of Terror, with Robespierre at the head, established a regime of extreme fear and violence. Thousands of people were executed without prior trial, accused of being counter-revolutionary. The French society was divided into faced factions, mired in a civil war that bled the country. Can you imagine the chaos and uncertainty of those days? But the revolution not only brought death and destruction, it also promoted deep changes in French society. The abolition of the monarchy, the declaration of the rights of man and citizen, and the establishment of a republic, although ephemeral in its beginnings, marked a before and after in the history of Europe. These ideals, despite the bloodbath, were seeds that sowed a new social order. What do you think on this side of the revolution? The execution of Louis XVI did not mark the end of turbulence, but the beginning of a new era. From the ashes of the revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte emerged, an ambitious young man who, with his military talent and his implacable determination, quickly climbed positions. Imagine the meteoric rise of this man, an outsider who became the master of France. His brilliant military strategy allowed him to consolidate power, crushing his internal and external enemies. Think of epic battles, the expansion of the French Empire throughout Europe. Napoleon, with his invincible army, rewritten the map of Europe, imposing his will with a combination of strength and diplomacy. Napoleon's rise brought with him a new order. A legal code was established, the Napoleonic Code, which deeply influenced the right of many countries. Visualize the creation of a modern, unified and efficient legal system, which replaced the feudal and chaotic laws of the old regime. It was a radical change, an attempt to create a more organized and fair society, at least in theory. Guillotine, symbol of a revolutionary justice or a ruthless revenge tool? That is the question we ask you today. For many, the execution of Louis XVI was a necessary act to end the old regime and its abuses. He was accused of betrayal of the nation, of conspiring against the revolution, and for them, capital punishment was the just punishment for their crimes. But, did it acted with justice, or did it yield to the thirst for revenge of a tired population of oppression? /prosody, /speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. The speed of the trial and the lack of an exhaustive legal process fed doubts about the impartiality of the revolutionary court. Some historians argue that the conviction was a farce, a political act to consolidate the power of the Jacobins and eliminate a dangerous enemy. For them, execution was not an act of justice, but a strategic elimination of an obstacle in the path of the new republic. What do you think? Was the execution of Louis XVI an act of historical justice, or a brutal adjustment of accounts? The story, as always, offers multiple interpretations, and yours is as valid as any other. The debate continues, and the figure of the executed king continues to generate controversy centuries later. Analyze the evidence, consider the different points of view, and form your own opinion. Remember, the story is not only what happened, but how we interpret it. But what did guillotine make so shocking? Its apparent efficiency concealed a powerful symbolism. For the revolution, it was not just about executing a king, but that demonstrating that death was the same for all, even for those who were considered above the law. Guillotine, with its relentless mechanism, became the great leveling, a symbol of equality before death, a radical concept in a society as hierarchized as the French of the old regime. Imagine the scene. The expectant crowd, the palpable tension in the air. The king, stripped of his crown and his privileges, submits to the same destination as any other citizen. There is no distinction, there is no favoritism. Guillotine, with its cold precision, was responsible for erasing social differences, at least at that final moment. That it was a visual statement, a blunt message for all those who believed in the superiority of the nobility. The execution of Louis XVI, seen through the prism of the guillotine, became a powerful metaphor of the revolution itself, a violent but necessary dismantling of the old order. The image of the monarch, crowded head, lying next to the plebs, was recorded in the collective memory, a brutal reminder of the new era of equality, or at least of the promise of equality, that the French Revolution intended to establish. A dream that, as we know, had a complex and contradictory ending. After his death, the figure of Louis XVI was transformed. For many, he became a martyr, an unfairly accused and executed king. Stories are woven about their courage in the guillotine, on a challenging look that challenged the revolution. Remember that, for some, its execution was a necessary act for freedom, while for others it was an atrocious crime. Other legends talk about their alleged miraculous escape, of a double that died instead. Do you imagine a Louis XVI who lives in secret, observing the France that condemned him? It is said that his ghost still is around the Palace of Versailles, remembering a time of splendor and power, an echo of the past that refuses to disappear. Those are just rumors, of course. There are also those who say that he hid an immense treasure before being captured, a treasure that remains hidden to this day, waiting to be found. The search for this mythical treasure is a legend that feeds the fascination by the last king of France. Can you imagine you finding it? But how did its execution compare with that of other monarchs? Think of the decapitation of Carlos I of England, an event that, although brutal, was held with some formality. There was a theatricality in the process, an almost ritual, which contrasted with the crude efficiency of the guillotine. The death of Louis XVI, on the other hand, was fast and, for many in his time, impersonal. The king was eliminated, without the pomp and circumstance of a long and public trial, only the cold edge of the machine. Unlike other executed kings, Louis XVI was denied a decent burial. His body, without the honors of his range, was thrown into a common grave. Imagine the difference with the state funeral that Maria Estuardo received. In spite of her tragic destination, his death, although violent, was framed in a religious and political context that gave him a martyr aura. Louis XVI, on the other hand, was a purely revolutionary act, stripped of any ritual that could mitigate its crudeness. Even comparing it with other executions during the French Revolution, that of Louis XVI had its peculiarities. While the guillotine became a symbol of the time, the execution of the king was an event with a much greater symbolic load. It was the end of the absolute monarchy, an accurate blow to the old regime. Observa como, a diferencia de otras ejecuciones más anónimas, esta razono en toda Europa y el mundo, mercando en antes y en después en la historia. /prosody, /speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. But the execution of Louis XVI was not just a historical fact. It became a canvas for artistic representation. Imagine the paintings that arose later. The king, with his serene face or perhaps full of terror, in front of the guillotine. Artists of the time, and many later, tried to capture the intensity of that moment, the mixture of violence and symbolism that defined it. How do you think they represented him? Some artists focused on the crowd, in the mixture of faces, between revolutionary euphoria and morbid curiosity. Others, on the other hand, focused on guillotine itself, that death instrument that became a symbol of the revolution. Think of the details. The dark and polished wood, the metallic brightness of the leaf, the blood that surely stained the ground. Artistic representations not only show the scene itself, but also the interpretation that each artist made of the event. How do you think the political context of the moment in the way in which the death of the king was represented? Was it a glorification of the revolution, a condemnation of the act, or something more complex? Think about the impact that the king had to see, a symbol of power and authority, die in that way. For many, it was a devastating blow to the belief in the monarchy and in the established order. Imagine the uncertainty that should have caused, the feeling that everything could change, that the rules of the game had been radically altered. Fear, insecurity, confusion, all that seized French society. The execution of Louis XVI was not only a political event, it was a collective trauma. That image, recorded in the memory of thousands of people, became a powerful symbol of violence and radical change. For supporters of the monarchy, it was a deep wound, a loss that marked the end of an era, and that wound influenced the way the power, legitimacy, and justice in later years were conceived. Even for those who celebrated the king's fall, the execution had a psychological impact. Extreme violence, the rupture of social order, political instability, all that generated a climate of fear and distrust. The triumph of the revolution was mixed with uncertainty about the future, an uncertainty that deeply marked the collective psyche that a new era opened, but with a very high psychological price. Imagine, for a moment, the echo of that axe resonating through the centuries. The execution of Louis XVI was not just a historical event. He marked a before and after in the way we perceive power, justice, and revolution. His death, witnessed by thousands, became a symbol, a turning point that still feeds debates about the legitimacy of power and nature of revolutionary violence. To what extent does the media employed justify such a dramatic end? Think of the works of art, the films, the books. How many times the execution of Louis XVI has been recreated and discussed? It has become a cultural icon, an obligatory reference to analyze the end of absolute monarchies and the birth of modern democracies. Although with their shadows, his image, transformed over time, continues to generate questions about the price of freedom and the search for justice. And you, what do you think? Do you think that the execution of Louis XVI was a necessary act for the progress of France, or an example of barbarism that stains history? The answer is probably not simple. But what is undeniable is that his death resonated, and continues to resonate, in the political and social debate to this day. His legacy, complex and controversial, reminds us that history is not only a set of dates and names, but an inexhaustible source of lessons and reflections. Think about the number of documents that survived the French Revolution, letters, newspapers, pamphlets. What do these primary sources tell us about the last moments of Louis XVI? Some stories describe their serenity before death, others talk about their terror. Analyzing these discrepancies is crucial to understand the complexity of the event and the subjectivity of the witnesses. Secondary sources, on the other hand, offer subsequent interpretations. Historians, over time, have analyzed these primary sources, offering different perspectives on the reign of Louis XVI and its execution. Fue un martir de la monarquía, un rey despótico o una víctima de las circunstancias. Each historian presents his analysis based on the available evidence, but also in his own historical context. Comparing primary and secondary sources, we can build a more complete image, although never completely objective, of the event. The royal family letters contrast with the stories of the revolutionaries, offering different versions of the same story. The key is in historical criticism, in discerning the truth between the multiple narratives and understanding the context in which they were created. Prosody. Speak. Speak. The prosody rate equals 90%. So what really happened? The sources paint us a heartbreaking picture. You can imagine the scene. Louis XVI, dressed in a simple suit, is driven to the guillotine. There are no signs of repentance or heroic courage, as some wanted to paint. The stories speak of a scared man, a king reduced to the most absolute vulnerability, faced with his own end. It is said that his last words were a brief prayer, a whisper lost in the tumult of the crowd. I imagine the silence that precedes him, the roar of the crowd, the moment when the sheet falls. Was it an act of revolutionary justice, or a summary execution of a man whose only crime was to have been born in the wrong place? The truth, as usually happens, is complex. Primary sources offer different perspectives, sometimes contradictory. Some witnesses speak of a cold and calculated execution, while others describe a chaotic and violent scene. Who lies? Who exaggerates? The answer is probably in the subjectivity of each story. I hope you enjoyed this video. The story of Louis XVI is complex, right? If you liked it, give like and subscribe for more. What do you think? Leave it in the comments. /prosody, /speak,